Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make your worst Monday morning look like a vacation in paradise. We're diving deep into the absolute worst jobs in medieval history. Occupations so horrific, they'd make a modern sanitation worker weep with gratitude for hazmat suits and workers' compensation. These weren't just bad jobs, they were soul-crushing, life-threatening, socially ostracizing nightmares that someone had to do to keep medieval society from collapsing into complete chaos. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in medieval Europe, and the career counselor just handed you a list of available positions. Executioner, human waste collector, plague body removal specialist, or professional rat catcher. Congratulations. You've just discovered that sometimes survival means accepting the unacceptable. Because in the medieval world, someone had to do the jobs that would make your skin crawl, your stomach turn, and your social status plummet faster than a stone dropped from a castle tower. Tonight, we're exploring the occupations that defined rock bottom in an age when rock bottom was already pretty low. These weren't just unpleasant jobs. They were positions that condemned entire bloodlines to social exile, physical danger, and the kind of daily horror that would break most modern minds before breakfast. From the depths of human waste pits to the blood-soaked scaffolds of public executions, we're about to meet the people who kept medieval civilization functioning while paying the ultimate price for their service. But here's what's truly fascinating about these medieval nightmare jobs. They weren't random punishments or cruel jokes played by feudal lords. They were essential, absolutely critical positions that kept entire cities from drowning in their own filth, succumbing to disease, or collapsing into lawless chaos. The people who performed these tasks weren't just society's rejects. They were its unsung foundation. And yet, for their indispensable service, they received nothing but contempt, isolation, and working conditions that would violate every safety regulation ever conceived. Let's start with perhaps the most universally reviled occupation in all of medieval history. A job so disgusting, so socially damaging, that workers were legally forbidden from appearing in public during daylight hours. Meet the gong farmer, medieval Europe's human waste disposal system, and a profession that redefined what it meant to have a crappy job. The gong farmer, also known as a nightman, was tasked with cleaning out the communal latrines and private cesspits that served as medieval Europe's bathroom facilities. Now, when I say cleaning out, I don't mean a quick scrub with some bleach and a mop. I mean manually scooping, hauling, and disposing of tons of human excrement that had been fermenting in deep pits for months, or even years. These workers spent their entire shifts, typically from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., submerged up to their waist or neck in liquid human waste, breathing toxic fumes that could kill them instantly. But the true horror of being a gong farmer wasn't just the disgusting nature of the work. It was the complete social exile that came with it. These workers were only allowed to operate under cover of darkness, not out of shame, but because the sight and smell of their work was considered so offensive that it could literally make people sick. They lived in designated areas outside city walls, wore special clothing to identify their profession, and were banned from most public spaces even when they weren't working. Their children inherited not just the job, but the social stigma, creating entire family lines trapped in a cycle of waste and ostracism. The physical dangers were extraordinary. The decomposing human waste produced methane and hydrogen sulfide, gases that could cause instant unconsciousness or death by asphyxiation. Workers regularly passed out from toxic fumes, and some never woke up. The risk of drowning was constant, as a single slip could send a worker plunging into liquid waste with no way to surface. Consider the tragic case of Richard the Raker, a London gong farmer who, in 1326, lost his footing while cleaning a cesspit and fell to his death in the very waste he was trying to remove. His death became a grim reminder that even the most essential jobs could turn fatal in an instant. The tools available to gong farmers were primitive beyond belief. Buckets, ladles, and their bare hands. That's it. No protective equipment, no safety protocols, no backup systems. They worked alone in cramped, suffocating conditions where help was impossible if something went wrong. The sheer volume of waste they processed was staggering. In the 14th century London, some areas had only 16 public latrines serving 30,000 people. The mathematical reality was horrifying. Each gong farmer was responsible for processing the waste of thousands of people, night after night, with no end in sight. Payment for this nightmare job was based on tonnage. 2 shillings per ton of human waste removed. While this might sound like decent money, consider what it meant. To earn a living wage, gong farmers had to process massive quantities of waste, spending longer hours in more dangerous conditions, increasing their exposure to disease and toxic gases. The economic incentive actually made the job more deadly as workers pushed themselves beyond safe limits just to survive financially. The psychological toll was immense. These workers lived in a world where their essential service was met with disgust and rejection. They couldn't form normal relationships, couldn't participate in community life, couldn't even be seen during daylight hours. They were the invisible foundation of medieval sanitation, crucial to preventing disease outbreaks that could kill thousands, yet treated as less than human for their efforts. But as horrific as the gong farmer's life was, it pales in comparison to our next profession, a job that required not just the ability to handle filth and disease, but the psychological fortitude to regularly take human life in front of cheering crowds. Welcome to the world of the medieval executioner, where technical skill met social isolation in the most brutal profession imaginable. The medieval executioner occupied perhaps the most paradoxical position in society. Absolutely essential to maintaining law and order, yet completely reviled by the very communities they served. These weren't bloodthirsty monsters who enjoyed their work. They were skilled professionals performing a crucial legal function that kept medieval society from descending into vigilante chaos. And for this service, they were condemned to live as social outcasts, feared and hated even as they prevented the collapse of civilized order. Becoming an executioner wasn't exactly a career choice. Most were either former criminals offered the job in exchange for their lives, or inherited the position from family members trapped in the profession. In Scandinavian countries, new executioners were deliberately maimed, having one or both ears cut off so they could be easily identified by the public. Some were branded on their foreheads, literally wearing their profession on their faces for life. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a systematic method of ensuring that executioners could never blend back into normal society. The technical demands of the job were extraordinary. A medieval executioner needed to master multiple methods of execution, each requiring different skills and equipment. Hanging demanded knowledge of rope construction, knot tying, and weight calculations to ensure a quick death rather than prolonged strangulation. Beheading required precision timing, proper blade maintenance, and the physical strength to sever a human head with a single blow. Botched executions were not just embarrassing, they were often punishable by death, as angry crowds or disappointed authorities might turn on the executioner who failed to perform competently. But execution was only part of the job. Medieval executioners served as society's handlers of all undesirable tasks. They collected taxes from prostitutes and lepers, managed gaming houses, maintained torture devices, disposed of animal carcasses, and oversaw various forms of corporal punishment. Between executions, they worked as unofficial doctors and surgeons, their intimate knowledge of human anatomy making them valuable healers even as they were feared as dealers of death. The irony was inescapable. The same hands that took life were often the only ones skilled enough to save it. The tools of the trade were as varied as they were horrifying. Axes, swords, ropes, wheels, racks, thumbscrews, branding irons, and iron boots. Each instrument required maintenance, skill, and precise application. The executioner's workshop was a chamber of horrors, containing an extensive arsenal of specialized devices, each designed to inflict specific types of pain and death, with maximum public impact and deterrent effect. The executioner had to understand not just how to use these tools, but when, why, and on whom, as different methods were prescribed for different crimes and social classes. The hereditary nature of the profession created entire bloodlines doomed to social ostracism. Children born to executioner families had no choice but to continue the grim family trade, ensuring their perpetual exile from normal society. They couldn't marry outside their caste, couldn't change professions, couldn't escape the stigma that followed their family name through generations. The executioner's children grew up knowing that their future was predetermined, that they would spend their lives taking others' lives, isolated from the very society they served. The psychological toll was immense. Executioners had to maintain emotional distance while performing acts that would traumatize most people. They had to function normally in their communities while knowing that everyone feared and despised them. They had to balance the technical requirements of their job with the human reality of what they were doing. Some developed elaborate rituals or religious practices to cope with the moral weight of their actions. Others simply accepted their role as necessary evil, finding meaning in the order they helped maintain, even as they were excluded from enjoying that order themselves. The social isolation extended beyond the executioner to their entire family. Executioner wives and children were shunned, excluded from guilds, churches, and social gatherings. They lived in designated areas, shopped at specific times, and followed unwritten rules designed to minimize their contact with respectable society. The executioner's home was often located outside city walls or in the least desirable districts, physically separating them from the communities they served. Yet despite all this horror and isolation, executioners were absolutely crucial to medieval justice systems. Without them, law enforcement would have collapsed, crimes would have gone unpunished, and social order would have disintegrated. They were the enforcement mechanism that made laws meaningful, the final authority that backed up royal decrees and judicial sentences. Their very existence, however terrible, was what allowed medieval society to function as something other than might makes right chaos. As we've seen with both gong farmers and executioners, medieval society created essential positions that destroyed the lives of those who filled them. But our journey into history's worst jobs is just beginning. Coming up, we'll explore the nightmare world of plague body collectors, workers who faced not just social stigma and physical danger, but the very real possibility of death from the diseases they were trying to contain. We'll meet the rat catchers who descended into sewers to battle vermin with their bare hands, and the fullers who spent their days stomping through vats of urine to process wool for England's booming textile industry. These weren't just bad jobs, they were positions that revealed the brutal mathematics of medieval survival. Someone had to do the work that kept cities from drowning in waste, prevented disease outbreaks from wiping out entire populations, and maintained the basic functions of civilization. The people who accepted these roles weren't heroes or volunteers. They were desperate individuals caught in a system that demanded their sacrifice for the greater good, while offering them nothing in return but contempt and early death. The question isn't why these jobs existed. It's how the people who performed them found the strength to continue day after day in conditions that would break most modern workers before their first shift ended. Their stories are testimonies to human endurance, desperation, and the terrible price paid by those who keep society functioning from the shadows. And as we'll discover, their experiences reveal truths about human nature, social organization, and survival that remain uncomfortably relevant today. But if gong farmers and executioners thought they had cornered the market on nightmare professions, they hadn't met the plague body collectors. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated 200 million people worldwide, it created a crisis that redefined what it meant to have a dangerous job. Suddenly, medieval cities faced a problem that made overflowing cesspits look manageable. Mountains of corpses piling up in streets, homes and public spaces, with no one willing or able to remove them. Enter the body collectors, men so desperate for work that they volunteered to handle plague victims in various stages of decomposition, while risking their own lives with every corpse they touched. These weren't trained medical professionals or seasoned undertakers. They were typically drawn from the lowest rungs of society, men with few other options who saw plague collection as the most money they'd ever make. And honestly, it probably was, because the job came with a mortality rate that made life insurance mathematically impossible. The physical realities of plague body collection were truly nightmarish. By the time collectors reached the bodies, decomposition had often advanced significantly. Bubonic plague victims developed massive swellings called buboes in their groin and armpits, some growing as large as apples or eggs. These buboes frequently burst, leaking rancid pus that soaked through clothing and filled the air with a stench that could be smelled across entire city blocks. If the plague attacked the lungs, victims coughed up bloody froth before convulsing to death, leaving bodies covered in dried blood and bodily fluids. The collectors worked at night, moving through infected districts calling out the now famous phrase, "Bring out your dead." Families, desperate to remove diseased corpses from their homes, would drag bodies that had sometimes been decomposing indoors for days. The smell was indescribable. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled, multiply it by 1,000, then realize that's just one body, and these workers were loading dozens onto carts every night. The carts themselves were instruments of horror. Piled high with corpses in various states of decay, they creaked through narrow medieval streets while fluids leaked through the wooden slats, leaving trails of contaminated liquid that created health hazards for weeks. The collectors had to physically handle each body, lifting, dragging, and stacking human remains while trying not to think about the fact that they were probably breathing in the same disease that had killed their cargo. At the height of the Black Death, these teams processed an estimated 25 million corpses across Europe. That's not a typo. 25 million human beings who had to be physically removed from where they died and transported to mass graves, plague pits, or just empty spaces outside city walls. The logistics were staggering. The psychological impact was worse. Body collectors developed their own grim procedures and hierarchies. Teams typically consisted of several men with specific roles. Some specialized in extracting corpses from homes, others in loading and transporting, still others in disposal at burial sites. They worked with primitive protective equipment, usually just cloth wrapped around their faces, which provided about as much protection against airborne disease as holding up an umbrella in a hurricane. The mortality rate among plague collectors was astronomical. Many died not from the plague itself, but from exhaustion, accidents, or other diseases contracted while working in the most unsanitary conditions imaginable. Those who survived often suffered permanent health problems from constant exposure to decomposing bodies and the toxic environments where they worked. Their life expectancy was measured in months, not years. But here's what makes the plague collector's story particularly tragic. These workers weren't just risking their lives for money, they were preventing an even greater catastrophe. Without systematic body removal, plague-infected corpses would have contaminated water supplies, attracted disease-carrying vermin, and turned entire cities into open-air morgues. The collectors were literally the last line of defense between their communities and complete societal collapse. Yet for this essential service, they received not just poor pay and dangerous working conditions, but complete social ostracism. Plague collectors were banned from most public spaces, forbidden from entering churches, and avoided by everyone who saw them coming. They lived in designated areas outside city walls, ate separately from their families to avoid contamination, and died largely unmourned because even their deaths were seen as inevitable consequences of their horrible profession. The equipment available to these workers was laughably inadequate. Wooden carts, cloth masks, and their bare hands. No gloves, no protective clothing, no disinfectants. They relied on speed and crude protective measures like smearing their skin with animal fat, believing it might prevent disease transmission. Some carried aromatic herbs or flowers, thinking pleasant smells could ward off infection. It was medieval germ theory at its most primitive, and it killed them in droves. Now, if you think plague body collection sounds bad, wait until you meet the rat catchers. These were the brave souls who descended into medieval sewers to battle vermin with nothing but their wits, their hands, and occasionally a trained dog or ferret. Rats weren't just nuisances in medieval Europe. They were harbingers of disease and death, capable of destroying entire food supplies and spreading epidemics that could wipe out populations. The rat catcher's job required them to work in the most unsanitary and dangerous locations where rats congregated. Sewers, grain stores, cellars, basements, and waste areas where disease transmission was most likely. These weren't the clean, spacious tunnels you see in movies. Medieval sewers were cramped, toxic environments filled with human waste, rotting garbage, and enough methane gas to cause explosions. And somewhere in this underground nightmare, rat catchers had to hunt creatures that could transmit plague, typhus, and dozens of other deadly diseases. The innovative rat catchers didn't use traps or cages. They caught the rodents by hand, barehanded, grappling with disease-carrying vermin in pitch-black conditions, while trying not to breathe too deeply or fall into the flowing sewage beneath their feet. Payment was per rat, which meant the more risks they took, the more money they made. This created a perverse incentive system where workers pushed themselves into increasingly dangerous situations just to earn a living wage. Many rat catchers brought dogs into the sewers with them, creating underground hunting parties that pursued rats through tunnels barely wide enough for a human body. The dogs, specially trained for this work, could track rats by scent and corner them in dead-end passages. But working with animals in toxic environments added another layer of complexity and danger. Dogs could get lost, injured, or poisoned, leaving their handlers alone in the darkness with no backup. The physical demands were extraordinary. Rat catchers spent hours crawling through tight spaces, often on their hands and knees in sewage and filth. They developed specialized techniques for reading rat behavior, understanding seasonal patterns, and predicting where infestations were likely to occur. This required not just physical courage, but genuine expertise, as successful rat catching demanded intimate knowledge of rodent psychology and urban geography. The bite risk was constant and serious. Rats, when cornered, would fight viciously, and their bites could transmit rabies, plague, or other diseases. Rat catchers regularly suffered infected wounds, blood poisoning, and mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. Many developed permanent scars and disabilities from their underground battles, visible reminders of a profession that left its mark on everyone who practiced it. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect was the isolation. Rat catchers worked alone in the dark, often for hours at a time, with no communication possible if something went wrong. They had to overcome claustrophobia, fear of disease, and the basic human revulsion to spending time in sewage-filled tunnels hunting diseased animals. The mental toughness required was extraordinary, and many workers turned to alcohol or other substances just to cope with the daily horror of their profession. The social status of rat catchers was complicated. Unlike gong farmers or executioners, they were actually respected for their work because everyone understood how essential pest control was to public health. A successful rat catcher could prevent epidemics, save food supplies, and protect entire communities from vermin infestations. But this respect came with a price. People were grateful for rat catchers while simultaneously finding them disgusting and frightening. The seasonality of the work created additional hardships. Rat populations fluctuated with weather, food availability, and breeding cycles, meaning rat catchers often faced periods of unemployment, followed by frantic activity during major infestations. They had to save money during busy periods to survive lean times, all while maintaining the equipment and animals necessary for their trade. Training in this profession was entirely hands-on and frequently fatal. There were no apprenticeships or formal instruction. New rat catchers learned by trial and error, often making mistakes that cost them their health or lives. The knowledge was passed down through families or small groups of workers who shared techniques and territory, creating informal guilds that provided some support in an otherwise isolated profession. The tools were simple but specialized. Besides their hands, rat catchers used various types of nets, clubs, and containers for transporting captured vermin. Some developed their own unique equipment, like modified spears for reaching rats in distant corners or special baskets for carrying live specimens. The most successful rat catchers were also inventors, constantly improving their methods and equipment to work more efficiently and safely. Speaking of efficiency, let's talk about the fullers, workers who spent their days stomping through vats of aged urine to process wool for England's booming textile industry. If you thought standing knee-deep in sewage was bad, try spending 8 hours a day marching in place while submerged in fermented human urine mixed with wool grease, lanolin, and whatever else got thrown into the fulling vats. The fuller's job was crucial to medieval England's economy. Wool was the backbone of English prosperity, with an estimated 15 million sheep outnumbering humans 3-1 by 1300. But raw wool was oily, greasy, and scratchy, completely unwearable, until it underwent the fulling process. This required workers to literally trample the wool in chemical baths, using the mechanical action of their feet and the chemical properties of ammonia-rich urine to clean and soften the fibers. The urine wasn't fresh. It was aged, fermented, and concentrated to maximize its ammonia content. Fullers worked in teams, standing waist-deep in these vats, while rhythmically stomping wool for hours at a time. The smell was indescribable, a combination of fermented urine, wet wool, lanolin, and human sweat that created an odor so distinctive that fullers could be identified from across a crowded marketplace. The physical demands were crushing. 8 hours of continuous marching in place while standing in caustic liquid. The fuller's feet became permanently stained and damaged from constant immersion in ammonia solutions. Many developed chronic foot problems, infections, and respiratory issues from breathing the fumes generated by their work. The repetitive motion caused joint problems and muscle strain that lasted long after the workday ended. The social status of fullers was contradictory. Their work was essential to England's most important industry, yet they ranked near the bottom of textile worker hierarchies. They were above only the dyers and other chemical workers, but below weavers, tailors, and everyone else involved in cloth production. This created a professional class that was economically important but socially despised, crucial to prosperity, but excluded from respectability. The working conditions were seasonal and weather-dependent, with fullers often working outdoors in all conditions. Rain made the work more miserable, but didn't stop production. Cold weather made standing in liquid even more unbearable, while hot weather intensified the chemical fumes and made the physical exertion nearly unbearable. There was no climate control, no protective equipment, and no safety protocols beyond whatever workers developed through bitter experience. The technical knowledge required was more sophisticated than it appeared. Fullers had to understand chemical processes, timing, temperature control, and quality assessment. They needed to know when wool was properly processed, how to adjust their techniques for different wool types, and how to maintain consistent results despite varying conditions. This expertise was gained through years of experience and often came at the cost of permanent health damage. The fulling process wasn't just about cleaning wool. It was about transforming a raw material into something valuable, taking coarse, unwearable fibre and creating the foundation for England's textile wealth. Fullers were literally the foundation of medieval England's economy, processing the raw material that funded armies, built cathedrals, and established England as a major European power. Yet for this crucial contribution, they received minimal pay, dangerous working conditions, and social stigma that followed them throughout their lives. These workers developed their own culture and traditions, finding ways to maintain dignity and community despite their challenging circumstances. They created work songs to maintain rhythm during the long hours of trampling, developed specialized clothing that could withstand the chemical environment, and formed tight-knit communities that provided mutual support in an otherwise hostile world. But as challenging as fulling was, it was nothing compared to the nightmare faced by our next group of workers. The petardiers, medieval siege specialists who carried unstable explosive devices weighing up to 100 pounds while approaching enemy fortifications under direct fire from defenders who could see them coming from considerable distances. These were the men who inspired the phrase, "hoisted by his own petard," and their mortality rate made even plague body collection look relatively safe. Petardiers were medieval warfare's ultimate high-risk specialists, operating in a profession where the phrase job security was literally meaningless because most workers didn't survive long enough to worry about career advancement. These siege experts carried primitive bombs called petards, conical or bell-shaped charges filled with gunpowder that weighed up to 100 pounds and had the delightful tendency to explode without warning at absolutely any moment. The job required teams of around 7 men to approach enemy fortifications while hauling these unstable explosive devices, all while defenders on the walls shot arrows, dropped stones, and poured boiling oil on anyone foolish enough to get within range. The petardiers had to attach their charges directly to gates, walls, or other fortifications, light the fuse, and retreat to what they hoped was a safe distance before the explosion. The problem was that medieval fusing mechanisms were about as reliable as a chocolate teapot, meaning petardiers never knew if they had seconds or minutes before their own weapon turned them into human confetti. The technical expertise required was extraordinary. Petardiers needed to understand explosives, structural engineering, timing mechanisms, and battlefield tactics. They had to calculate blast effects, assess weak points in fortifications, and coordinate their attacks with other siege operations. This wasn't just about carrying a bomb and lighting it. It was about understanding how to bring down massive stone walls using primitive technology while people were actively trying to kill you. The mortality rate was astronomical. Most petardiers died not from enemy action, but from premature detonation of their own devices. The survivors often suffered permanent injuries including deafness, burns, missing limbs, and psychological trauma that made it virtually impossible to continue working. This created a profession with almost no experienced veterans, as anyone who lived long enough to become skilled was too damaged to keep working. The work was exclusively nighttime or dawn operations, as approaching fortifications in daylight was essentially suicide. Teams operated in complete darkness, carrying unstable explosives across rough terrain while trying to avoid enemy patrols, sentries, and the dozens of obstacles placed specifically to stop siege equipment. Navigation was by feel and memory, with no room for error because getting lost meant either walking into enemy hands or having your petard explode while you were still carrying it. Training was minimal and usually fatal. There were no schools for petardiers, no apprenticeship programs, no gradual skill development. New workers learned by watching others, and if they were lucky, they might survive their first few missions long enough to understand what they were doing. Most didn't. The knowledge base was constantly being rebuilt as experienced workers died and were replaced by desperate volunteers who had no idea what they were signing up for. The psychological pressure was immense. Petardiers had to function normally while knowing that each mission was probably their last. They couldn't form long-term relationships, couldn't plan for the future, couldn't even be sure they'd survive the night. Many turned to alcohol or religion, seeking either oblivion or salvation from the constant awareness that death was literally strapped to their backs. But even petardiers weren't the most psychologically demanding profession in medieval Europe. That distinction belongs to the leech collectors, workers who deliberately expose themselves to blood-sucking parasites as part of their regular job duties. These medical supply gatherers had to wade through marshes, ponds, and wetland areas where leeches congregated, often using their own bodies as bait to attract the creatures they needed to harvest. Leech collection was crucial to medieval medicine, as bloodletting was considered essential treatment for almost every ailment. Physicians needed steady supplies of healthy leeches, and someone had to provide them. The collectors typically worked by standing still in leech-infested waters, while the parasites attached themselves to exposed skin. Once enough leeches had latched on, the collectors would carefully remove them and store them for later medical use. The process required detailed knowledge of different leech species, as medical practitioners preferred specific types for different treatments. Collectors needed to understand seasonal patterns, breeding cycles, and habitat preferences to ensure consistent supply throughout the year. This meant spending countless hours in swamps and marshes, studying leech behavior while allowing them to feed on your blood as part of the research process. The physical dangers extended far beyond simple blood loss. Leech collectors worked in disease-prone environments where waterborne pathogens thrived. They faced constant risk of infection from both the leeches themselves and the contaminated water where they worked. Many developed chronic health problems related to repeated blood loss and exposure to parasites, bacteria, and other organisms that inhabited their workplace. The storage and transport of live leeches required specialized knowledge to keep them healthy and viable for medical use. Dead or diseased leeches were worthless, so collectors had to understand how to maintain optimal conditions during collection, storage, and delivery. This added another layer of complexity to an already challenging profession, as workers had to balance their own health against the needs of their parasitic inventory. The psychological aspect was perhaps the most challenging part. Leech collectors had to overcome the basic human revulsion to deliberately allowing parasites to feed on their bodies. This wasn't an occasional occurrence, but a regular part of their work routine. They had to develop mental strategies for coping with the constant sensation of creatures draining their blood, while maintaining the focus necessary to do their job effectively. The seasonal nature of the work created additional hardships. Leech populations fluctuated with weather and breeding cycles, meaning collectors faced periods of high demand, alternating with times when their services weren't needed. They had to save money during productive seasons to survive lean periods, all while maintaining their health despite the constant blood loss and exposure to diseases. But if leech collectors thought they had mastered the art of dangerous bodily exposure, they hadn't met the lime burners. These workers faced extreme physical dangers while producing one of medieval society's essential building materials, working with substances so dangerous they were sometimes used as weapons of war. Lime burning required heating limestone to extremely high temperatures to produce quicklime, a crucial ingredient in mortar and construction. The process involved maintaining fires hot enough to transform solid rock into a caustic substance that reacted violently with water, could cause severe chemical burns, and had the delightful tendency to spit, steam, and occasionally explode without warning. The heat alone was nearly unbearable. Lime kilns operated at temperatures that could melt copper, and workers had to tend these fires continuously for days at a time. They worked in shifts around massive stone furnaces that radiated heat like miniature suns, making the surrounding area feel like the surface of hell. The physical demands included hauling limestone, maintaining precise temperatures, and managing fires that could easily kill anyone who got too close. But the real danger came from the quicklime itself. This substance was so caustic and unstable that it was literally used as a weapon, thrown at enemies to cause painful burning in the eyes, mouth, or anywhere it contacted sweat. Lime burners worked with this material daily, handling tons of a substance that could blind, maim, or kill with a single mistake. Protective equipment was non-existent, so workers relied on experience, luck, and the kind of careful technique that comes from knowing that carelessness meant permanent disfigurement. The chemical reactions were unpredictable and violent. Quicklime could react explosively with even small amounts of moisture, including human sweat. Workers who got too close during certain parts of the process risked being caught in steam explosions that could strip skin from bone. The lime itself was so fine that it became airborne easily, creating clouds of caustic dust that burned lungs, eyes, and any exposed skin. Lime burners developed their own techniques for managing these dangers, including specialized clothing, timing strategies, and methods for handling the finished products safely. But these were learned through trial and error, often at the cost of severe injuries that served as painful lessons for other workers. The knowledge was passed down through informal networks of workers who shared techniques for survival in an industry that regularly maimed its practitioners. The economic importance of lime burning made it a necessary evil that communities couldn't avoid. Quicklime was essential for construction, agriculture, and various industrial processes that kept medieval society functioning. Without lime burners, buildings would crumble, fields would become unproductive, and entire industries would collapse. Yet the workers who provided this crucial service faced working conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. The social status of lime burners was complex. Their product was valuable and their skills were in demand, but the dangers of their profession made them objects of both respect and fear. People needed what they produced, but didn't want to get too close to workers who handled materials that could be used as weapons. This created a professional isolation similar to that faced by other dangerous occupations, where essential workers were valued but kept at arm's length. The long-term health effects were devastating. Lime burners who survived their careers often suffered from respiratory problems, chemical burns, and various ailments related to prolonged exposure to caustic substances and extreme heat. Many developed chronic conditions that made normal life impossible, turning retirement into a prolonged struggle with the accumulated damage from years of dangerous work. As we've seen throughout this journey into medieval Europe's worst occupations, these jobs shared common themes that reveal uncomfortable truths about human society and survival. They were all essential to maintaining basic civilization, yet they condemned their practitioners to lives of danger, social isolation, and physical suffering. The people who performed these tasks weren't volunteers or heroes. They were desperate individuals caught in economic systems that demanded their sacrifice while offering minimal compensation and no protection. The mathematics of medieval survival were brutal and unforgiving. Someone had to clean the waste, execute the criminals, collect the plague bodies, catch the rats, process the wool, handle the explosives, gather the leeches, and burn the lime. These weren't optional services that communities could do without. They were the foundation upon which medieval society rested, performed by people who paid the ultimate price for keeping civilization functioning. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how little has changed in terms of societal attitudes toward necessary but unpleasant work. Even today, the people who handle our waste, work in dangerous conditions, or perform tasks that others find distasteful often face similar patterns of essential service combined with social marginalization. The medieval world may seem distant and primitive, but its labor dynamics reveal patterns that persist in modern societies. The courage required to perform these jobs was extraordinary, not because the workers were naturally brave, but because they found ways to continue despite conditions that would break most people. They developed communities, traditions, and survival strategies that allowed them to maintain human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Their stories are testimonies to human resilience, and the lengths people will go to survive in systems that offer them few alternatives. But our exploration of medieval Europe's nightmare professions isn't over. We still haven't met the Toshas who searched through sewage for valuables, the resurrectionists who robbed graves for medical schools, or the sin-eaters who absorbed the spiritual contamination of the dead. Each of these occupations reveals new dimensions of human desperation and societal necessity, showing us that the medieval world's capacity for creating horrible jobs was matched only by people's willingness to accept them when survival demanded it. These professions represented just the tip of the iceberg when it came to medieval Europe's catalogue of occupational nightmares. Because if you thought handling human waste and explosive devices was bad, wait until you meet the Toshas, urban scavengers who made their living by wading through the sewage systems of major cities, searching for anything valuable enough to justify spending their days knee-deep in liquid filth. Toshas were the ultimate recyclers of the medieval world, but instead of sorting through clean materials in well-ventilated facilities, they worked in the underground tunnel systems that carried away the waste of entire cities. These weren't just sewers, as we might imagine them today. They were sprawling networks of cramped, toxic passages filled with everything that medieval urban life could produce. Human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff, kitchen scraps, and the occasional human body that had been dumped rather than properly buried. The working conditions were beyond description. Toshas spent their shifts crawling through tunnels barely wide enough for human passage, breathing air so toxic it could cause permanent lung damage, while searching through flowing sewage for coins, jewelry, utensils, or anything else that might have been accidentally dropped or deliberately discarded. The smell was so overwhelming that experienced Toshas often lost their sense of smell entirely, a condition they considered a professional advantage rather than a disability. The dangers were constant and varied. Toxic gases could cause unconsciousness or death without warning. Flash floods from sudden rainstorms could drown workers in rapidly rising sewage. Unstable tunnel walls could collapse, burying Toshas alive in the very waste they were searching through. And then there were the rats, not just ordinary vermin, but massive, aggressive creatures that had grown fat on the abundant food sources available in the sewers and weren't afraid to defend their territory against human intruders. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of toshing was the uncertainty. Unlike other professions where workers knew what they'd face each day, toshers never knew what they might find. Sometimes they'd discover valuable items that made their dangerous work financially worthwhile. Other times, they'd spend entire shifts finding nothing but waste, disease, and disappointment. This unpredictability created a gambling mentality that kept workers returning to conditions that rational people would flee. The equipment available to toshers was minimal and primitive. A long stick for probing through waste, a basket for collecting fines, and whatever clothing they could afford to protect themselves from the corrosive environment. Many toshers worked barefoot because shoes would be destroyed by the acidic sewage within days, and most couldn't afford to replace them regularly. The lack of protective gear meant that cuts, scrapes, and infections were constant occupational hazards. Toshers developed their own underground economy and culture. They established territories, trading rights, and informal rules for sharing profitable areas. Some specialized in specific types of valuable items, developing expertise in identifying precious metals or gemstones even when covered in filth. Others focused on quantity, over quality, collecting anything that might have resale value regardless of its condition. The social status of toshers was complex and contradictory. Officially, they were considered criminals, as searching through sewers was typically illegal. City authorities wanted to prevent people from damaging drainage systems or creating health hazards. But unofficially, toshers were tolerated because they provided a valuable service, removing blockages and reporting structural problems that could affect entire neighborhoods. The health consequences of toshing were severe and inevitable. Workers regularly contracted diseases from exposure to contaminated water and waste. Skin conditions, respiratory problems, and digestive ailments were considered normal occupational hazards. Many toshers died young from diseases that were directly related to their working conditions, but poverty left them with few alternatives to this dangerous profession. Now, if you think toshing sounds like a nightmare, prepare yourself for one of the most morally complex professions in medieval history. The resurrectionist, also known as body snatchers, who robbed fresh graves to supply corpses for medical schools and anatomical research. These workers operated in the shadowy borderland between medicine and crime, performing a service that was simultaneously essential to medical advancement and absolutely forbidden by law and social custom. Medical education in medieval and early modern Europe faced a fundamental problem. Physicians needed to understand human anatomy to treat patients effectively, but religious and cultural taboos severely limited access to human bodies for dissection and study. The Church forbade the desecration of Christian burial sites, and families were understandably reluctant to donate their loved ones' remains for scientific purposes. This created a black market for fresh corpses that resurrection men were happy to supply. Resurrection work required a unique combination of physical strength, technical skill, and psychological detachment that few people possessed. The job involved locating recently buried bodies, excavating graves quickly and quietly, removing corpses without damaging them, and transporting the stolen remains to medical schools or private physicians. All of this had to be accomplished under cover of darkness, while avoiding night watchmen, angry families, and the various hazards associated with working in graveyards at night. The physical demands were extraordinary. Digging up a recently buried coffin was back-breaking work that had to be completed in just a few hours to avoid detection. Resurrection men worked with shovels, crowbars, and ropes, often in adverse weather conditions, that made the job even more difficult. They had to be strong enough to lift dead bodies, fast enough to complete their work before dawn, and coordinated enough to work as a team in complete darkness. But the technical aspects were equally challenging. Resurrection men had to understand burial practices, soil conditions, and grave construction to work efficiently. They needed to know how long bodies remained suitable for anatomical study, which graveyards offered the best opportunities, and how to identify fresh graves without obvious markers. This required genuine expertise that was developed through years of experience and often passed down through criminal families. The psychological demands were perhaps the most difficult aspect of the profession. Resurrection men had to overcome deeply ingrained cultural taboos about disturbing the dead while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary to handle decomposing bodies on a regular basis. They worked in environments that most people found terrifying, surrounded by symbols of death and mortality, while performing acts that society considered deeply immoral. The legal risks were enormous. Body snatching was a serious crime that could result in imprisonment, heavy fines, or even execution depending on local laws and circumstances. Resurrection men faced constant threats from law enforcement, angry communities, and families who discovered their loved ones' graves had been robbed. The work required not just criminal skills, but also the ability to live with the constant fear of capture and punishment. The economic aspects of resurrection work created their own set of problems. Medical schools and private physicians were willing to pay substantial sums for fresh corpses, but the illegal nature of the trade meant that prices fluctuated wildly based on supply, demand, and risk factors. Resurrection men might earn significant money during periods of high demand, but they could also face extended periods without income when authorities cracked down on body snatching or when medical schools had adequate supplies. The working relationships between resurrection men and their medical customers were complex and often strained. Physicians needed the bodies but wanted to maintain plausible deniability about how they were obtained. This created a system where resurrection men bore all the legal and social risks. while medical professionals enjoyed the benefits of their illegal services. The power dynamics were heavily skewed against the workers who faced imprisonment to supply materials for respectable doctors. Resurrection men developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and maximizing their efficiency. They studied burial schedules, bribed gravekeepers, and established networks of informants who could provide information about recent deaths and burial locations. Some even maintained legitimate jobs as grave diggers or cemetery workers, using their access to plan and execute body-snatching operations. The seasonal nature of the work created additional challenges. Winter months were particularly difficult because frozen ground made digging more laborious and dangerous. Summer brought increased decomposition rates that reduced the value of stolen bodies but also made the work more physically revolting. Resurrection men had to adjust their techniques and expectations based on weather conditions and seasonal factors that affected both their working conditions and the quality of their product. But even resurrection men, for all their moral flexibility and criminal expertise, couldn't match the psychological burden carried by our next profession. The sin eater, a figure so morally complex that their very existence challenged fundamental religious and social beliefs. These individuals performed one of the most spiritually demanding jobs imaginable, literally absorbing the sins of the dead through ritualistic consumption of food placed on corpses. Sin eating emerged from the medieval belief that unconfessed sins could prevent souls from entering heaven, leaving them trapped in purgatory or worse. When someone died with unresolved spiritual burdens, families could hire a sin eater to perform a ritual that would transfer those sins from the deceased to the living person, allowing the dead soul to find peace while condemning the sin eater to carry an additional spiritual burden. The ritual itself was deeply disturbing and profoundly symbolic. The sin eater would be brought to the home where a body lay in preparation for burial. Food, typically bread and ale, would be placed on the corpse's chest or beside the body. The sin eater would then consume this food while reciting specific prayers or incantations designed to transfer the deceased's sins to themselves. The payment was usually minimal, often just the food itself plus a small amount of money, but the spiritual cost was considered enormous. The social isolation faced by sin eaters was absolute and permanent. They were seen as spiritually contaminated individuals who had voluntarily taken on the sins of others, making them dangerous to be around and unsuitable for normal social interaction. Sin eaters lived as outcasts, banned from churches, excluded from community gatherings, and avoided by everyone except desperate families seeking their services. They couldn't marry, couldn't form normal relationships, and couldn't participate in the religious life that was central to medieval society. The psychological burden was crushing. Sin eaters had to live with the knowledge that they carried not just their own spiritual failures, but also the accumulated sins of everyone they had served. According to the beliefs of their time, they were walking repositories of human wickedness, condemned to hell, not just for their own transgressions, but for the moral failures of dozens or hundreds of other people. The mental strain of carrying this burden while living in complete social isolation drove many sin eaters to alcoholism, madness, or suicide. The theological implications were complex and controversial. While some communities accepted sin eating as a legitimate religious practice, others viewed it as heretical or blasphemous. The church's official position was generally opposed to sin eating, but local practices often diverged from church doctrine, especially in rural areas where folk beliefs remained strong. This religious uncertainty added another layer of stress to an already difficult profession. The working conditions were unpredictable and emotionally demanding. Sin eaters were called upon whenever someone died with significant spiritual concerns, which could happen at any time and in any location. They had to travel to remote areas, work with grieving families, and perform their rituals in emotionally charged environments where their presence was both desperately needed and deeply resented. The knowledge required for sin eating went beyond simple ritual performance. Effective sin eaters needed to understand local religious beliefs, funeral customs, and the specific spiritual concerns that might require their services. They had to know appropriate prayers, understand the symbolic meaning of different foods and rituals, and be able to adapt their practices to different circumstances and family traditions. The economic aspects of sin eating were particularly harsh. The work was irregular and unpredictable, with long periods between jobs when sin eaters had no income. The payment was typically minimal because families viewed the service as spiritually necessary but morally distasteful. Sin eaters often lived in extreme poverty, surviving on the charity of people who simultaneously needed and despised them. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of sin eating was its hereditary nature. Children born to sin eaters were often considered spiritually tainted by association, making it difficult for them to escape their parents' profession or social status. Some sin-eating families continued the practice for generations, creating bloodlines trapped in spiritual isolation and social exile. The decline of sin-eating coincided with changes in religious practice and social organization, but the profession persisted in some areas well into the modern era. The last known sin-eater in Wales reportedly died in the early 20th century, ending a tradition that had persisted for hundreds of years, despite religious opposition and social change. These professions represent the extreme end of medieval Europe's occupational spectrum, jobs so difficult, dangerous, or morally complex that they challenged basic assumptions about work, society, and human dignity. They reveal the brutal mathematics of survival in a world where someone had to perform every necessary task, regardless of the personal cost to the individuals who accepted these roles. What's particularly striking about these occupations is how they reflected and reinforced social hierarchies while simultaneously undermining them. The people who performed the most essential services often occupied the lowest social positions, creating a paradox where society's foundation was built on the labor of people it refused to acknowledge or respect. This contradiction reveals fundamental tensions in human social organization that persist even today. The courage and resilience displayed by workers in these professions was extraordinary, not because they were naturally heroic, but because they found ways to maintain human dignity under circumstances that seemed designed to strip it away. They created communities, developed survival strategies, and established traditions that allowed them to cope with conditions that would destroy most people. But their stories also reveal the terrible price paid by individuals caught in economic systems that offered few alternatives to accepting the unacceptable. These weren't people who chose their professions out of interest or aptitude. They were desperate individuals who accepted horrible working conditions because the alternatives were even worse. Their experiences illuminate the relationship between poverty, desperation, and the willingness to accept dangerous or degrading work. As we continue our journey through medieval Europe's worst jobs, we'll discover that even these extreme examples don't represent the absolute bottom of the occupational hierarchy. There were positions so dangerous, so socially destructive, or so morally compromising that they make everything we've discussed so far look relatively appealing. The medieval world's capacity for creating nightmare jobs was matched only by human desperation and the brutal requirements of survival in an unforgiving world. The medieval world had an almost infinite capacity for creating occupational nightmares, and we're about to meet some professions that make sin eating look like a comfortable desk job. Because if you thought absorbing the spiritual contamination of the dead was psychologically demanding, wait until you hear about the human mules. Workers whose entire existence revolved around carrying impossibly heavy loads across vast distances while their bodies slowly disintegrated under the weight. Human mules weren't just laborers who occasionally lifted heavy objects. They were specialized carriers whose job was to transport goods, materials, and supplies across terrain where wheeled vehicles couldn't operate. Think of them as medieval delivery drivers, except instead of trucks they used their spines. Instead of roads they navigated mountain passes and forest paths. And instead of workers' compensation, they got permanent spinal damage and an early grave. The physical demands were absolutely crushing. Human mules regularly carried loads weighing 100 to 200 pounds, sometimes more, strapped to their backs with crude harnesses that distributed the weight unevenly across their shoulders and spine. They walked for miles over rough terrain, often in extreme weather conditions, while their vertebrae slowly compressed under loads that would challenge modern machinery. The human spine simply wasn't designed for this kind of sustained abuse, and it showed. The loads they carried were as varied as they were heavy: stone blocks for cathedral construction, grain sacks for distant markets, military supplies for army campaigns, trade goods for merchant expeditions. Whatever needed to be moved from one place to another, human mules carried it. They were living pack animals, treated with about as much consideration as the donkeys and oxen they occasionally worked alongside. The routes they travelled were deliberately chosen for their inaccessibility to conventional transport. Narrow mountain paths, where a single misstep meant plummeting to death. Dense forest trails, where branches tore at exposed skin and hidden roots caused devastating falls. Swamp crossings where the footing was treacherous and the water was contaminated with diseases that could kill within days. These weren't scenic hiking trails. They were endurance tests that claimed lives regularly. The working conditions varied with the seasons, but were never good. Winter meant trudging through snow and ice while carrying loads that became even heavier when soaked with melted precipitation. Summer brought heat exhaustion and dehydration, as workers struggled to maintain adequate fluid intake while burning enormous amounts of energy. Spring and fall offered their own challenges, with mud, rain, and unpredictable weather that could turn a difficult journey into a fatal one. The physical deterioration was rapid and irreversible. Most human mules developed severe back problems within their first few years of work. Herniated discs, compressed vertebrae, and chronic pain became normal parts of life. Many lost the ability to stand upright, walking in a permanent crouch that made them easily identifiable even when they weren't working. The damage was cumulative and progressive, meaning that workers got weaker and more disabled as they gained experience. The social status of human mules was complicated by their essential nature. Everyone needed things transported, but no one wanted to acknowledge the human cost of that transportation. They were simultaneously indispensable and invisible, crucial to commerce and construction, while being treated as barely human. This created a professional identity built around endurance and suffering, with workers taking pride in their ability to carry impossible loads under terrible conditions. The economic exploitation was systematic and brutal. Human mules were typically paid by the load or by the distance traveled, creating incentives to accept heavier burdens and longer journeys, despite the obvious health risks. They couldn't negotiate better working conditions because there were always desperate people willing to accept worse terms. The profession attracted individuals with no other options, creating a workforce that could be exploited with impunity. The equipment available to human mules was primitive and inadequate. Rope harnesses that cut into shoulders and chest. Crude back supports that provided minimal protection against spinal damage. Basic footwear that offered little protection against sharp rocks or slippery surfaces. Most workers improvised their own equipment using whatever materials they could afford, leading to endless variation in quality and effectiveness. But even human mules, for all their physical suffering and economic exploitation, didn't face the moral complexity of our next profession. The pardoner, religious officials who sold forgiveness for sins while knowing that their entire livelihood was built on spiritual fraud. These were professional manipulators of faith, exploiting people's deepest fears about salvation and damnation for personal profit. Pardoners occupied a unique position in medieval religious hierarchy, authorized by church officials to sell indulgences that supposedly reduced the time souls spent in purgatory. They traveled from town to town with official documents and religious relics, promising spiritual benefits in exchange for monetary donations. The problem was that many partners were completely corrupt, selling fake indulgences, fabricating relics, and pocketing money that was supposed to fund religious causes. The psychological demands of being a partner were extraordinary. These individuals had to present themselves as holy men while knowing they were committing fraud. They had to preach about salvation while actively damning themselves through their deceptive practices. They had to maintain convincing performances as representatives of God while exploiting people's genuine spiritual concerns for personal gain. The working methods of partners were sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. They studied human nature, learning to identify people's specific fears and weaknesses. They developed elaborate stories about the power of their relics and the urgency of purchasing indulgences. They created artificial scarcity by claiming limited-time offers or special spiritual opportunities that wouldn't be available again. The social consequences of pardoning work were severe. Corrupt partners faced the constant risk of exposure, which could result in excommunication, imprisonment, or even execution. They lived with the knowledge that their fraudulent activities undermined legitimate religious authority and damaged people's faith in spiritual institutions. Yet the potential profits were so substantial that many continued despite the obvious risks. The moral complexity was crushing. Pardoners often started with genuine religious convictions, but gradually became corrupted by the money and power their position provided. They watched themselves transform from spiritual guides into spiritual predators, yet found it impossible to stop because they had become financially dependent on their fraudulent income. This created a psychological trap where workers despised themselves but couldn't escape their profession. The technical skills required for successful pardoning were considerable. Pardoners needed to understand theology, church law, and religious practice well enough to sound credible when discussing spiritual matters. They had to be skilled actors, capable of projecting sincerity while lying about fundamental religious questions. They needed to understand crowd psychology and individual motivation to maximize their sales effectiveness. The geographic demands were exhausting. Pardoners traveled constantly, moving from town to town before their fraudulent activities could be discovered, or before local authorities could investigate their credentials. They lived as nomads, never staying long enough to form genuine relationships or establish permanent homes. This constant movement created additional stress and isolation that compounded the moral burden of their work. The competition between pardoners was fierce and often violent. Multiple pardoners working the same territory would undercut each other's prices, expose each other's fraudulent practices, or even resort to physical violence to protect their profitable routes. This created an environment where religious fraud was combined with criminal behavior, making pardoning one of the most morally complex professions in medieval Europe. But if pardoners thought they had cornered the market on moral complexity, they hadn't met the professional informants who made their living by betraying friends, neighbors, and family members to political and religious authorities. These were the medieval equivalent of secret police informants, people who survived by selling information about others while living in constant fear that their own betrayals would be discovered. Professional informants operated in the shadowy world of medieval politics, where accusations of heresy, treason, or disloyalty could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. They provided authorities with information about suspicious activities, dangerous opinions, or potential threats to established order. The work required them to maintain normal social relationships while secretly gathering intelligence that could destroy the lives of people who trusted them. The psychological burden was enormous. Informants had to live double lives, presenting themselves as loyal friends and community members while systematically betraying the people around them. They had to remember lies, maintain false relationships, and constantly calculate the risks and benefits of their treacherous activities. The stress of this deception often led to paranoia, alcoholism, and mental breakdown. The social dangers were constant and severe. If their activities were discovered, informants faced not just official punishment, but also violent revenge from the people they had betrayed. They couldn't trust anyone, couldn't form genuine relationships, and couldn't even be sure that other informants weren't gathering information about them. This created a world of universal suspicion, where everyone was potentially both predator and prey. The working methods required sophisticated psychological manipulation and social skills. Successful informants learned to identify people's vulnerabilities, political opinions, and personal secrets. They developed techniques for encouraging others to reveal dangerous information while maintaining their own cover. They had to be skilled listeners, careful observers, and convincing actors all at the same time. The economic aspects were unpredictable and dangerous. Informants were typically paid per piece of useful information, creating incentives to manufacture or exaggerate threats when genuine intelligence was scarce. They competed with other informants for the attention of authorities, sometimes fabricating evidence against rivals to eliminate competition. The income was irregular and always at risk of disappearing if their cover was blown. The moral deterioration was progressive and irreversible. Informants started by betraying strangers or people they disliked, but gradually found themselves informing on friends, family members, and even lovers as they became more desperate for income or more paranoid about their own security. Each betrayal made it easier to commit the next one, creating a downward spiral that destroyed both their humanity and their relationships. But even professional informants didn't face the ultimate nightmare combination of physical danger, social isolation, and moral corruption that characterized our final profession. The professional torturer, individuals whose job was to extract confessions and information through the systematic application of pain, while maintaining the technical precision necessary to keep their victims alive and responsive. Professional torturers occupied perhaps the most psychologically demanding position in medieval society, required to inflict precise amounts of pain without causing death or permanent disability that would interfere with their victims' ability to provide information. They were skilled technicians of suffering, combining medical knowledge with psychological insight and mechanical expertise to break human resistance while preserving human life. The technical demands were extraordinary. Torturers needed to understand human anatomy, pain thresholds, and psychological breaking points. They had to know how much pressure to apply, which techniques would be most effective for different types of victims, and how to maintain their subjects in a state of maximum suffering without causing fatal damage. This required genuine expertise that was developed through years of practice and often passed down through family lines. The equipment was specialized and constantly evolving. Racks for stretching joints beyond their natural limits, thumb screws for crushing small bones, iron boots for crushing feet, hot irons for burning flesh, water torture devices for simulating drowning. Each instrument required specific knowledge and technique to use effectively, and torturers had to maintain and modify their equipment to maximize its psychological and physical impact. The psychological skills were as important as the technical ones. Effective torturers studied their victims' personalities, fears, and motivations to determine which approaches would be most likely to break their resistance. They learned to recognize signs of genuine confession versus desperate lies told simply to stop the pain. They had to maintain professional detachment while inflicting suffering that would traumatize most people, even to witness. The working conditions were deliberately horrifying. Torture chambers were designed to maximize fear and despair, with blood-stained walls, rusty chains, and the screams of other victims echoing through stone corridors. Torturers worked in environments that would drive most people insane, surrounded by instruments of pain and the constant evidence of their profession's effects on human bodies and minds. The social isolation was absolute and permanent. Torturers were feared and hated by everyone, including the authorities who employed them. They couldn't form normal relationships, couldn't participate in community life, and couldn't escape the knowledge that everyone who looked at them saw a monster. their children inherited not just the profession, but also the social stigma, creating family lines trapped in cycles of violence and isolation. The moral burden was crushing and cumulative. Each torture session added to the psychological weight carried by professional torturers who had to live with the memory of every scream, every broken bone, every moment of human suffering they had caused. Many turned to alcohol, drugs, or religion, seeking relief from the mental torture of their own memories, but nothing could erase the knowledge of what they had done. The legal protections were minimal and unreliable. While torturers operated with official authorization, they could be sacrificed if political winds changed or if their actions became too controversial. They served at the pleasure of authorities who might decide that scapegoating a torturer was preferable to accepting responsibility for their own policies. This created additional stress and uncertainty in an already impossible profession. The training was informal and traumatic. New torturers learned by watching experienced practitioners, gradually taking on more responsibility as they proved their ability to inflict pain without succumbing to sympathy or revulsion. There were no schools or formal apprenticeships, just brutal on-the-job education that destroyed human empathy as part of the learning process. The physical demands were considerable. Torture was hard work that required strength, endurance, and coordination. Torturers had to maintain precise control over their instruments while applying significant force. They worked long hours in uncomfortable positions, often while their victims struggled, screamed, and tried to fight back. The physical strain was compounded by the psychological stress of their activities, but perhaps the most tragic aspect of professional torture was its self-perpetuating nature. Torturers who survived their careers were often so psychologically damaged that they were incapable of normal human relationships or productive work. They became dependent on their profession, not just for income, but for identity, trapped in cycles of violence that defined their entire existence. These represent the absolute bottom of medieval Europe's occupational hierarchy, jobs so terrible that they challenged basic assumptions about human nature, social organization, and moral possibility. They were performed by people who had reached the end of all other options, individuals so desperate that they accepted work that would destroy their bodies, minds, and souls. What makes these stories particularly powerful is how they reveal the hidden costs of maintaining medieval civilization. Every cathedral built required human mules to carry the stones. Every confession extracted required professional torturers to break human resistance. Every pardoner's fraud undermined religious authority while enriching corrupt officials. Every informant's betrayal maintained political control while destroying social trust. These weren't aberrations or historical curiosities. They were integral parts of a social system that functioned by distributing its costs unevenly, placing the heaviest burdens on people with the least power to resist or escape. The workers who performed these jobs weren't volunteers or heroes. They were victims of economic systems that offered them no alternatives to accepting the unacceptable. Their stories illuminate fundamental questions about human society that remain relevant today. How do we balance individual welfare against collective needs? What price are we willing to pay for security, order, and prosperity? Who bears the costs when societies organize themselves around principles that require some people to sacrifice everything for others' benefit? The medieval world created these nightmare professions because it needed them. Someone had to do the work that kept civilization functioning, regardless of the personal cost to the individuals who performed it. The people who accepted these roles weren't different from us in any fundamental way. They were human beings caught in circumstances that offered them terrible choices between different forms of suffering. What's most striking about these occupations is how they reveal the relationship between necessity and human dignity. The most essential work was often the most dehumanizing, creating a paradox where society's foundation depended on people willing to sacrifice their humanity for collective survival. This contradiction exposes tensions in human social organization that we still struggle with today. The courage displayed by workers in these professions wasn't the heroic kind celebrated in stories and songs. It was the quiet, desperate courage of people who continued functioning despite conditions that should have broken them. They found ways to maintain some sense of self while performing work that systematically destroyed everything that made life worth living. Their legacy isn't just historical. It's a reminder of what human beings are capable of enduring when survival demands it, and a warning about the costs of social systems that require some people to sacrifice everything so that others can live in comfort and security. These medieval nightmare jobs reveal truths about human nature and social organization that remain uncomfortably relevant in our modern world. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval Europe's worst occupations, we're left with profound questions about the relationship between work, dignity, and survival. These jobs existed because they were necessary, performed by people who had no choice but to accept conditions that would horrify us today. Their stories are testimonies to human endurance, warnings about social inequality, and reminders that the cost of civilization is often paid by people whose names history never remembers. The next time you complain about your job, remember the gong farmers knee-deep in human waste, the executioners isolated by their essential cruelty, the plague collectors handling diseased corpses, and all the others who kept medieval civilization functioning while paying the ultimate price for their service. Their suffering built the foundation upon which our modern world rests, and their stories deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of human resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. Because in the end, these weren't just the worst jobs in medieval history. They were the jobs that made all other jobs possible, performed by people who sacrificed everything so that society could continue to exist. And that, perhaps, is the most sobering lesson of all. But wait, there's more. Because if you thought medieval Europe had exhausted its capacity for creating occupational nightmares, you haven't heard about the mudlarks yet. These were the urban scavengers who made toshas look like they worked in luxury resorts. While toshas at least had the dignity of working in enclosed sewers, mudlarks spent their days crawling through the tidal mudflats of major rivers, searching for anything valuable in the toxic sludge left behind by retreating waters. Picture this. You're crouched in knee-deep mud that's been marinating in human waste, industrial runoff, and rotting organic matter for months. The Thames in medieval London wasn't the scenic waterway tourists admire today. It was an open sewer that carried everything the city wanted to get rid of. And twice a day, the tide would retreat, exposing vast expanses of contaminated mud where desperate people could search for lost treasures. Mudlarks were predominantly children and elderly people, individuals so marginalized by society that they had no other means of survival. They worked barefoot in conditions that would challenge hazmat teams, feeling through toxic sludge with their hands and feet, hoping to find coins, jewelry, tools, or anything else that might have been dropped or discarded in the river. The mud itself was a mixture of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial waste, and centuries of accumulated filth that created a cocktail of diseases, waiting to infect anyone brave or desperate enough to wade through it. The working conditions changed with every tide, creating a profession that operated on nature's schedule rather than human convenience. Mudlarks had to time their scavenging carefully, working only during a low tide when the riverbed was exposed. This meant working in the early morning hours when the mud was coldest and most treacherous, often in complete darkness, using nothing but moonlight and instinct to guide their search. They had perhaps 2 to 4 hours before the tide returned, and anyone caught in the mud flats when the water rose faced the very real possibility of drowning in liquid sewage. The physical dangers were extraordinary and constantly evolving. The mud itself was unstable. capable of trapping workers who sank too deeply or moved too quickly. Broken glass, sharp metal objects, and animal bones hidden in the sludge could cause cuts that would inevitably become infected in the contaminated environment. The toxic nature of the mud meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening infections within days. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of mudlarking was the competition. Because the work was so dangerous and the potential rewards so minimal, mudlarks developed territorial systems and conflicts that turned the riverbed into a battlefield. Children fought other children for access to the most promising sections of mudflat. Elderly workers used their experience and knowledge of tidal patterns to claim the best scavenging areas, sometimes resorting to violence to defend their territories against younger, stronger competitors. The social status of mudlarks was so low that they existed almost entirely outside normal society. They were too poor to afford proper clothing, too dirty to enter most public spaces, and too desperate to maintain the social connections that might have offered alternative employment. Many lived in makeshift shelters along the riverbank, existing in a parallel world that operated according to different rules and values than the society that surrounded them. The health consequences were inevitable and severe. Mudlarks regularly contracted diseases from the contaminated environment, developed respiratory problems from breathing toxic fumes, and suffered from malnutrition because their irregular income made it impossible to maintain adequate nutrition. Most died young from diseases directly related to their working conditions, and those who survived often suffered from permanent disabilities that made other forms of work impossible. The equipment available to mudlarks was virtually non-existent. A cloth bag for collecting fines, maybe a stick for probing through particularly deep mud, and whatever rags they could wrap around their feet for minimal protection. Most worked with their bare hands because gloves would be destroyed by the acidic mud within hours, and they couldn't afford to replace them. The lack of protective equipment meant that direct contact with toxic substances was unavoidable and constant. Now, if mudlarking represents the absolute bottom of legitimate scavenging work, our next profession takes us into territory so morally complex that it challenges basic assumptions about right and wrong. Meet the professional mourners, individuals who were paid to grieve at funerals for people they had never met, performing emotional displays that were both completely artificial and absolutely essential to maintaining social status and religious propriety. Professional mourning emerged from the medieval belief that the intensity of grief displayed at a funeral reflected the deceased person's importance and the family's social status. A poorly attended funeral, or one where the mourning seemed inadequate, could damage a family's reputation for generations. But what happened when someone died without enough genuine mourners to create the appropriate level of emotional display? That's where professional mourners came in, skilled performers who could produce convincing displays of grief on demand. The psychological demands of professional mourning were extraordinary. These workers had to generate authentic-seeming emotion for people they had never known while suppressing their own genuine feelings about death and loss. They studied different types of grief, learning to distinguish between the mourning appropriate for a child versus an elderly person, a sudden death versus a long illness, a beloved family member versus a respected but distant relative. Each funeral required a different emotional performance, and professional mourners had to adapt their displays to match the specific circumstances and social expectations. The physical requirements were equally demanding. Professional mourning involved hours of intense emotional performance that was genuinely exhausting. Mourners had to wail, sob, tear their clothing, and sometimes inflict minor injuries on themselves as signs of grief. They worked in all weather conditions, often outdoors in cemeteries or churchyards where they were exposed to wind, rain, and cold, while maintaining their emotional performances. The physical strain of simulated grief was compounded by the psychological stress of constantly performing emotions they didn't feel. The social dynamics were complex and often contradictory. Professional mourners were essential to maintaining funeral propriety, yet they were also seen as evidence of social failure. Families who needed to hire mourners were essentially admitting that the deceased hadn't been loved enough to generate adequate, genuine grief. This created a situation where professional mourners were simultaneously necessary and shameful, required for social respectability while serving as reminders of social inadequacy. The training for professional mourning was informal but intensive. New mourners learned by observing experienced practitioners, gradually developing their own styles and specialties. Some focused on the wailing and sobbing that was expected from female mourners. Others specialized in the more restrained but still visible grief appropriate for male mourners. The most skilled could adjust their performances based on subtle cues from family members, matching their emotional intensity to the family's actual feelings while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous grief. The economic aspects were unpredictable and seasonal. Professional mourners were paid per funeral, with rates varying based on the deceased person's social status and the family's wealth. The work was irregular, with busy periods during plague outbreaks or harsh winters alternating with extended periods of unemployment. Mourners had to save money during busy times to survive lean periods, all while maintaining the wardrobe and appearance necessary for their profession. The moral complexity was crushing. Professional mourners had to confront death and grief on a daily basis while maintaining emotional distance from the very emotions they were performing. They became experts in human suffering while remaining detached from it, creating a psychological split that many found impossible to maintain. Some mourners reported becoming unable to feel genuine grief even in their own lives, while others became so overwhelmed by constant exposure to death that they developed severe depression or anxiety. But professional mourning, for all its psychological complexity, was nothing compared to the nightmare faced by the relic authenticators, individuals whose job was to verify the authenticity of religious artifacts in a world where fraud was rampant, and the penalties for error could include excommunication or execution. These were the medieval equivalent of art experts, except instead of evaluating paintings, they were determining whether pieces of bone, cloth, or wood were genuine remnants of saints and biblical figures. Relic authentication required an extraordinary combination of religious knowledge, scientific observation, and political awareness. Authenticators needed to understand the lives and deaths of hundreds of saints, the historical context of biblical events, and the complex chain of custody that supposedly connected modern relics to their ancient origins. They had to distinguish between genuine artifacts and the countless forgeries that flooded medieval markets, making decisions that could affect the spiritual and economic life of entire communities. The pressure was enormous because the stakes were so high. A relic authenticated as genuine could bring pilgrims, donations, and prestige to a church or monastery for centuries. A relic exposed as fraudulent could destroy reputations, trigger political conflicts, and undermine religious authority. Authenticators worked knowing that their decisions could make or break religious institutions, enrich or impoverish communities, and affect the spiritual lives of thousands of believers. The technical challenges were almost impossible. How do you verify that a piece of wood is actually from the true cross, when there were enough supposed fragments scattered across Europe to build several complete crosses? How do you authenticate a saint's bones, when record-keeping was sporadic and preservation techniques were primitive? How do you distinguish between genuine age and artificial aging when forgers were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their techniques? The political dangers were constant and severe. Relic authenticators often found themselves caught between competing religious authorities, each with their own financial and political interests in the authentication process. A decision that pleased one faction could make enemies of another, and in the medieval world, powerful enemies could mean imprisonment, exile, or death. Authenticators had to navigate complex webs of religious and political allegiance while maintaining their professional integrity. The moral burden was extraordinary. Many authenticators suspected or knew that relics they were being asked to authenticate were fraudulent. But they also understood that these objects provided genuine spiritual comfort to believers and economic support to religious communities. They faced impossible choices between exposing fraud and protecting faith, between scientific honesty and social stability. Some chose to authenticate questionable relics rather than destroy the hopes and beliefs of sincere believers. The working conditions were challenging and often dangerous. Authenticators traveled constantly, moving from monastery to monastery and church to examine relics and investigate their histories. They worked in poorly lit conditions, using primitive tools and techniques to analyze objects that might be centuries old. They faced the constant risk of accidentally damaging priceless artifacts while trying to determine their authenticity. The competition between authenticators was fierce and sometimes violent. Different experts often reached different conclusions about the same relics, leading to professional conflicts that could escalate into legal battles or physical confrontations. Some authenticators were bribed or threatened by parties with financial interests in their decisions, while others faced pressure from religious authorities who had already committed to particular positions. But even relic authenticators, for all their professional pressure and moral complexity, didn't face the ultimate combination of physical danger and social responsibility that characterized our final group of nightmare professions. The bridge keepers, individuals whose job was to maintain and defend the critical river crossings that connected medieval communities while facing constant threats from floods, ice, military attacks, and structural collapse. Bridgekeeping in medieval Europe was far more than just collecting tolls from travelers. These workers were responsible for maintaining complex wooden and stone structures that were constantly threatened by natural disasters and human interference. They lived on or near their bridges, often with their entire families, creating communities that existed in constant danger of destruction from floods, ice dams, military attacks, or simple structural failure. The technical demands were extraordinary. Bridgekeepers needed to understand engineering, carpentry, stonework, and hydraulics to maintain structures that were pushing the limits of medieval construction technology. They had to recognize signs of structural weakness, organize repair work, and coordinate with local authorities to fund necessary maintenance. Many bridges required constant attention, with daily inspections and regular repairs to prevent catastrophic failures that could isolate entire communities. The physical dangers were constant and varied. Floods could wash away bridges in minutes, often with little warning, trapping bridge keepers and their families on structures that were disintegrating beneath them. Ice dams could create sudden pressure that would collapse even the strongest bridges, while military conflicts could turn bridges into battlegrounds where keepers found themselves caught between opposing armies. The work required them to climb on dangerous structures, work over fast-moving water, and handle heavy materials in conditions that would challenge modern safety equipment. The social responsibility was crushing. Bridge keepers weren't just maintaining infrastructure, they were preserving the economic and social connections that held communities together. A collapsed bridge could isolate towns for months, disrupting trade, preventing medical emergencies from being treated, and cutting off communication with the outside world. The weight of this responsibility, combined with the constant awareness that their work was literally a matter of life and death for their communities, created psychological pressure that many found impossible to bear. The economic pressures were complex and contradictory. Bridge keepers were typically funded through tolls collected from travelers, but they also faced constant pressure to keep tolls low enough to encourage trade, while collecting enough money to fund necessary maintenance. They had to balance the immediate needs of travelers against the long-term requirements of structural maintenance, often making decisions that pleased no one while trying to keep their bridges functional and safe. The working conditions varied dramatically with the seasons and weather. Winter brought ice that could destroy bridges in hours, while spring floods could wash away months of careful maintenance work. Summer heat made working with metal and stone almost unbearable, while autumn storms could create emergency situations that required immediate response regardless of other conditions. Bridgekeepers worked around the clock during crisis periods, often going days without sleep while trying to save their structures from natural disasters. The isolation was profound and often dangerous. Many bridges were located in remote areas where bridgekeepers and their families lived alone, miles from the nearest community. This isolation made them vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, and medical emergencies that couldn't be treated without traveling to distant towns. They lived as guardians of critical infrastructure, while being cut off from the very communities they served. The hereditary nature of bridgekeeping created family lines trapped in cycles of danger and responsibility. Children born to bridgekeepers often had no choice but to continue the family profession, inheriting not just the job, but also the constant stress of maintaining critical infrastructure with inadequate resources and primitive technology. They grew up knowing that their lives and the lives of their communities depended on their ability to maintain structures that were constantly threatened by forces beyond their control. The training was entirely practical and often traumatic. New bridgekeepers learned by working alongside experienced practitioners, gradually taking on more responsibility as they proved their ability to handle the physical and psychological demands of the job. There were no formal education programs or standardized procedures, just brutal experience gained through years of dealing with floods, storms, structural failures, and the constant pressure of maintaining critical infrastructure. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of bridgekeeping was how it revealed the fundamental vulnerability of medieval society. These workers stood at the critical junctions that held communities together, maintaining connections that were essential to trade, communication, and survival. Yet they did this work with primitive tools, inadequate funding, and constant awareness that natural disasters or human conflicts could destroy in minutes what had taken years to build. Bridgekeepers embodied the paradox of medieval infrastructure, essential to civilization, yet constantly threatened by the very forces that civilization was supposed to control. They were guardians of progress in a world where progress was always temporary, maintaining connections in a society where isolation was always just one flood or battle away. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval Europe's most nightmarish occupations, we're confronted with a sobering truth about human civilization and the price of progress. These jobs weren't historical aberrations or cruel jokes played by feudal lords. They were the foundation upon which medieval society rested, performed by people who sacrificed their health, dignity, and often their lives to maintain the basic functions that kept communities from collapsing into chaos. Every cathedral that rose toward heaven was built with stones carried by human mules whose spines compressed under impossible loads. Every legal system that maintained order was enforced by executioners who lived as social outcasts while preventing vigilante chaos. Every plague outbreak that was contained required body collectors who risked their lives to prevent greater catastrophes. Every bridge that connected isolated communities was maintained by keepers who lived in constant danger to preserve vital connections. The courage displayed by these workers wasn't the heroic kind celebrated in songs and stories. It was the quiet, desperate courage of people who continued functioning despite conditions that should have broken them. They found ways to maintain human dignity while performing work that systematically destroyed everything that made life worth living. They created communities and traditions that provided meaning in circumstances designed to strip meaning away. What makes their stories particularly powerful is how they reveal the hidden mathematics of social organization. Medieval society functioned by distributing its costs unevenly, placing the heaviest burdens on people with the least power to resist or escape. The workers who performed these nightmare jobs weren't volunteers or heroes. They were ordinary people caught in economic systems that offered them no alternatives to accepting the unacceptable. Their legacy extends far beyond medieval history. These occupations reveal fundamental tensions in human social organization that persist today. How do we balance individual welfare against collective needs? What price are we willing to pay for security, order, and prosperity? Who bears the costs when societies organize themselves around principles that require some people to sacrifice everything for others' benefit? The medieval world created these nightmare professions because it needed them, and it found people desperate enough to perform them because survival demanded it. The people who accepted these roles weren't different from us in any fundamental way. They were human beings facing impossible choices in circumstances that offered them only different forms of suffering. Their stories serve as both testament to human endurance and warning about the costs of social systems that require such sacrifices. They remind us that civilization's foundation is often built on the labor of people whose names history never remembers, whose suffering enables others' comfort, whose sacrifice makes others' prosperity possible. But they also demonstrate something profound about human resilience and the capacity to find meaning even in the most degrading circumstances. These workers didn't just survive their nightmare professions, they created cultures, traditions, and communities that provided dignity and purpose despite conditions designed to destroy both. They proved that human spirit can endure almost anything when survival requires it. The next time you face challenges in your own work, remember the gong farmers standing waist-deep in human waste, the executioners isolated by their essential cruelty, the plague collectors handling diseased corpses, the mudlarks crawling through toxic sludge, the professional mourners performing artificial grief, the relic authenticators navigating impossible moral choices, and the bridge keepers maintaining civilization's critical connections while living in constant danger. Their suffering built the foundation upon which our modern world rests. Their endurance in the face of impossible circumstances reminds us what human beings are capable of surviving when they have no choice. And their stories challenge us to build societies that don't require such sacrifices, that distribute both benefits and burdens more fairly, that recognize the humanity of everyone who contributes to collective survival. Because in the end, these weren't just the worst jobs in medieval history. They were the jobs that made all other jobs possible, performed by people who gave everything so that society could continue to exist. And that, perhaps, is both the most inspiring and most sobering lesson we can learn from their extraordinary stories of survival against impossible odds. These workers lived and died in the shadows of history, their stories buried beneath centuries of shame and deliberate forgetting. Yet, they were the invisible pillars that held up the entire structure of medieval civilization. Without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste, diseases would have consumed entire populations, and the basic functions of society would have collapsed into barbarism. But here's what's truly remarkable about these nightmare professions. They reveal something profound about human nature that transcends their historical context. When faced with impossible circumstances, people don't just survive, they adapt. They create meaning where none should exist. They find dignity in degradation. They build communities in isolation. The gong farmers developed their own codes of honor. The executioners created rituals that helped them cope with their grim duties. The plague collectors sang songs to keep their spirits up while hauling cartloads of death through empty streets. This wasn't just about economic desperation, though poverty certainly played its role. It was about something deeper, something that speaks to the core of what makes us human. These workers discovered that even in the worst possible circumstances, people can find ways to maintain their humanity, not by escaping their conditions, but by transforming them from within. The social mechanisms that created these professions also reveal uncomfortable truths about power and privilege that echo through history. Medieval society didn't randomly assign people to these nightmare jobs. There was a clear hierarchy of who got sacrificed and who got protected. The wealthy could always buy their way out of dangerous work. The powerful could delegate the dirty jobs to others. The connected had options that the isolated never saw. This created a system where society's most essential functions were performed by its most disposable people. The work that kept everyone alive was done by people everyone wanted to forget. The services that prevented civilizational collapse were provided by workers who were excluded from the civilization they preserved. It's a pattern that should make us deeply uncomfortable because it's not as historical as we'd like to believe. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more complex. Many of these workers weren't just victims of circumstance. They were active participants in systems they understood and sometimes even embraced. The executioners took pride in their technical skill. The relic authenticators saw themselves as guardians of faith. The bridge keepers viewed their work as sacred duty to their communities. This complicates our understanding of exploitation and choice. Yes, these people were trapped by economic necessity and social structure, but they also found ways to take ownership of their roles, to transform degrading work into something meaningful, to create professional identities that gave them purpose even when society denied them respect. The paradox is striking. The same work that destroyed these workers' bodies and isolated them socially also became the source of their identity, community, and meaning. They were simultaneously victims and agents, oppressed and empowered, essential and expendable. It's a contradiction that reveals the complexity of human adaptation under extreme conditions. What's perhaps most remarkable is how these workers maintained hope despite facing conditions that should have crushed it. The human mules who carried impossible loads still planned for the future. The mudlarks searching through toxic sludge still believed tomorrow might be better. The professional mourners performing artificial grief still experienced genuine joy in their private lives. This resilience wasn't naive optimism or ignorant bliss. These people understood their circumstances better than anyone. They knew the risks, felt the pain, and lived with the consequences of their choices every day. Yet they continued not just to survive, but to find moments of beauty, connection, and meaning within their nightmare professions. Their stories challenge our assumptions about what constitutes a life worth living. We tend to think that dignity requires comfort, that meaning requires pleasant circumstances, that community requires social acceptance. But these workers discovered forms of dignity, meaning, and community that existed independently of external validation or material comfort. The technical skills these workers developed were often extraordinary, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about dangerous and difficult tasks. The gong farmers understood waste management principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for hundreds of years. The executioners mastered anatomy and physiology that rival medical knowledge of their time. The bridge keepers developed engineering insights that inform construction practices for generations. Yet this expertise was never formally recognized or recorded. It lived in the hands and minds of workers who were socially invisible, passed down through informal networks that operated outside official institutions. This represents an enormous loss of human knowledge, entire libraries of practical wisdom that disappeared when these professions died out or were replaced by technology. The gender dynamics of these occupations also reveal important truths about medieval society's structure and values. Most of the worst jobs were performed by men, not because women were protected from dangerous work, but because they were excluded from it. Women face their own set of nightmare professions, often involving domestic service, textile production, or sex work that carried different but equally devastating risks. This gendered division of horrible labor shows how medieval society distributed suffering not just by class and wealth, but by sex and social role. Everyone suffered, but they suffered in different ways that reflected and reinforced existing power structures. The system was designed to ensure that no matter how bad things got for some people, others would always have it worse. The religious dimensions of these professions add another layer of complexity to their stories. Many of these workers operated in the grey areas between sacred and profane, between divine service and social contamination. The sin-eaters literally absorbed spiritual pollution to help others achieve salvation. The relic authenticators served as gatekeepers between genuine faith and fraudulent devotion. This created profound theological and psychological tensions for workers who were simultaneously essential to religious life and excluded from its benefits. They served God by doing work that made them untouchable in the eyes of the church. They facilitated others' spiritual salvation while risking their own souls. They maintained the sacred order by accepting contamination that made them profane. The economic systems that sustained these professions were as complex as they were brutal. These weren't simple market transactions, where supply met demand at fair prices. They were elaborate networks of exploitation, desperation, and social control that ensured a steady supply of workers for jobs no rational person would accept under normal circumstances. The payment structures were designed to trap workers rather than compensate them fairly. Piece rates that encouraged dangerous overwork, seasonal employment that created cycles of desperation, hereditary obligations that made escape impossible, social stigma that limited alternative opportunities. Each element reinforced the others, creating systems that were nearly impossible to break out of once you were caught in them. Yet within these oppressive structures, workers still found ways to exercise agency and create value for themselves. They formed informal unions and mutual aid societies. They developed pricing strategies and quality standards. They created markets for their services and negotiated better terms when possible. They weren't passive victims, but active participants who worked within constraints to improve their circumstances however they could. The health consequences of these professions were catastrophic and cumulative, yet they also drove innovations in medicine and safety that benefited everyone. The constant exposure to disease and injury that these workers faced made them inadvertent test subjects for treatments and preventive measures that would eventually protect entire populations. The gong farmers' experiences with toxic gases led to better understanding of underground ventilation. The executioners' anatomical knowledge contributed to surgical techniques. The plague collectors' observations about disease transmission informed early epidemiology. The bridge keepers' engineering failures taught lessons that improved construction practices. This represents another tragic irony of these professions. The workers who bore the greatest risks often generated the knowledge that would eventually protect others from similar dangers. Their suffering became the foundation for safety measures they would never benefit from. Their deaths the data that would save lives they would never know. The psychological coping mechanisms these workers developed were as sophisticated as any modern therapy techniques. They created rituals that provided structure and meaning. They developed communities that offered support and understanding. They practiced forms of mental detachment that protected their core identity from the degrading aspects of their work. These weren't primitive or superstitious practices, but genuine psychological innovations that allowed human beings to function under impossible conditions. They represent forms of wisdom about human resilience that we're only beginning to understand and appreciate in our modern therapeutic frameworks. The technological changes that eventually eliminated many of these professions also eliminated the communities and cultures that had grown up around them. When machines replaced human waste collectors, when modern medicine made professional mourners unnecessary, when improved construction techniques reduced the need for bridge keepers, entire ways of life disappeared. This wasn't just economic displacement, but cultural extinction. The songs, stories, traditions, and knowledge systems that these workers had created over centuries vanished along with their jobs. The communities that had provided meaning and support dissolved when their economic foundation disappeared. We tend to celebrate technological progress as unqualified good, and certainly these innovations reduced human suffering in measurable ways. But they also destroyed forms of human adaptation and community that had taken generations to develop. The gains were clear and immediate. The losses were subtle and permanent. The lessons these medieval nightmare professions teach us about work, dignity, and human value remain painfully relevant today. We live in a world where essential work is still often dangerous, degrading, and poorly compensated, where the people who perform society's most necessary functions are frequently its most marginalized members, where technological progress eliminates jobs faster than it creates alternatives for displaced workers. The specific circumstances have changed, but the fundamental dynamics persist. Someone still has to do the dangerous work, handle the toxic materials, deal with the waste, care for the sick and dying, maintain the infrastructure that keeps civilization functioning. And too often, those someones are people with the fewest options and the least protection. The medieval workers we've explored tonight didn't choose their nightmare professions because they wanted to. They accepted them because survival demanded it, because their societies created conditions where such choices became necessary, because the alternatives were even worse than the terrible work they performed. Their stories remind us that behind every functioning society are invisible armies of workers whose sacrifice makes everyone else's comfort possible. Their courage wasn't the kind that gets celebrated in monuments or remembered in songs. It was the quiet, desperate courage of people who kept going when everything in their circumstances should have made them stop. They found ways to maintain their humanity while performing work designed to destroy it. They created meaning in meaninglessness, dignity in degradation, community in isolation. They proved that human beings are capable of adapting to almost anything when they have no choice, and that adaptation can preserve what's most essential about us, even when everything else is stripped away. Their legacy isn't just historical curiosity, but urgent reminder that the price of civilization is often paid by people whose names we never learn, that essential work is frequently invisible work, that the most necessary jobs are often the most thankless ones, that human dignity can survive almost anything, but it shouldn't have to. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled bedroom with your modern plumbing and your worker protections and your social safety net, remember the gong farmers and executioners and plague collectors and all the others who made such comfort possible. Remember that someone, somewhere, is still doing the work that no one wants to do, but everyone needs done. Their stories echo across the centuries, not as relics of a primitive past, but as mirrors reflecting truths about human nature and social organization that we haven't yet learned to change. They remind us that civilization's foundation is built on sacrifice, that progress requires someone to pay the price, that the distance between medieval nightmare and modern comfort is smaller than we like to believe. Because in the end, these weren't just the worst jobs in medieval history. They were the jobs that taught us what human beings are capable of enduring, what societies are willing to demand, and what price we're prepared to let others pay for our collective survival. And those lessons, uncomfortable as they are, remain as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. The darkness is closing in around us now, and it's time to let these ancient voices fade back into the silence from which we called them. But their whispers will linger, reminding us that every age has its nightmare professions, its invisible workers, its necessary sacrifices. The forms change, but the fundamental questions remain. Who pays the price for civilization? What are we willing to accept in the name of progress? And how do we honor the courage of those who keep the world functioning from its shadows? Sleep well, knowing that others are awake in the darkness, doing the work that makes your rest possible. And remember, when you wake tomorrow morning, that someone, somewhere, is still carrying the weight that allows you to walk freely through a world built on their sacrifice. The medieval world's capacity for creating occupational nightmares seems almost infinite when we consider that we haven't even touched on the absolutely soul-crushing profession of the lime burner. These workers faced extreme physical dangers while producing one of medieval society's most essential building materials, working with substances so caustic and unstable that they were literally used as weapons of war. Lime burning required workers to heat limestone to temperatures that could melt copper, transforming solid rock into quicklime through a process that was part chemistry, part endurance test, part Russian roulette with explosive materials. The kilns these workers tended burned day and night, radiating heat that made the surrounding area feel like the surface of hell. Workers had to maintain these infernos continuously, feeding them fuel and monitoring temperatures that could easily kill anyone who got too close. But the real horror wasn't the heat, it was the quicklime itself. This substance was so violently reactive with water that even human sweat could trigger explosive reactions. Workers handled tons of material that could blind them instantly, strip skin from bone, or cause fatal burns with the slightest mistake. There was no protective equipment, no safety protocols, just experience gained through watching other workers suffer horrific injuries. The quicklime would spit and steam unpredictably, creating clouds of caustic dust that burned lungs and eyes. Workers developed chronic respiratory problems, chemical burns that never fully healed, and often went blind from repeated exposure to lime dust. Many suffered from what we'd now recognize as chemical poisoning, their bodies slowly breaking down from constant exposure to substances that were literally eating them alive. The irony was crushing. Lime burners produced the mortar that built cathedrals, the material that created the very foundations of medieval civilization's greatest achievements. Yet they worked in conditions so dangerous that their product was classified as a weapon. The same substance they handled daily was thrown at enemies during sieges to cause maximum suffering and terror. The social isolation was profound. People feared lime burners not just for their appearance, which was often permanently scarred and disfigured, but for their association with materials that could maim or kill. Children ran from them in the streets. Adults crossed themselves when lime burners passed. They lived as walking reminders of what happened to people who worked with substances too dangerous for normal human contact. The knowledge required was extraordinary and completely unrecorded. Lime burners understood chemical processes, temperature control, and material science principles that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. They knew exactly how to transform limestone into quicklime without killing themselves in the process, a skill set that represented generations of accumulated wisdom paid for with countless injuries and deaths. But if lime burners thought they had mastered the art of dangerous chemical work, they hadn't met the dyers, workers who spent their days immersed in toxic solutions that could poison them slowly or kill them quickly, depending on which chemicals they were using and how careless they got with the mixing. Medieval dyers worked with substances that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Mercury for creating brilliant reds, lead compounds for deep yellows, arsenic for vibrant greens. These weren't just toxic, they were cumulative poisons that built up in workers' bodies over years, causing madness, paralysis, and agonizing deaths that could take months to complete. The working process required dyers to stand for hours in vats of boiling chemical solutions, stirring massive quantities of fabric while breathing fumes that attacked their nervous systems. The heat was unbearable, the smell was overwhelming, and the chemicals were slowly destroying their bodies from the inside out. Many dyers developed tremors, memory loss, and personality changes that marked them as clearly as any physical disfigurement. The color hierarchy was literally a death sentence hierarchy. The most expensive colors required the most dangerous chemicals, meaning that dyers who worked with luxury fabrics faced the highest mortality rates. Creating royal purple meant working with substances so toxic that workers often died within years of starting the job. The more beautiful the color, the more likely it was to kill the person who created it. The apprenticeship system was particularly cruel. Young boys were brought into dye shops as children, their small size making them useful for reaching into tight spaces and handling delicate work. But this also meant they were exposed to toxic chemicals during their most vulnerable developmental years. Many suffered permanent brain damage, stunted growth, or early death from poisoning that accumulated throughout their childhood. The waste products were as dangerous as the dyes themselves. Spent chemical solutions were typically dumped into rivers or onto fields, creating environmental hazards that affected entire communities. Dyers weren't just poisoning themselves, they were poisoning everyone downstream from their workshops. The beautiful colors that adorned noble clothing came at a cost, measured in contaminated water supplies and poisoned soil. But even dyers, with their slow chemical deaths and toxic work environments, couldn't match the sheer physical brutality faced by the stone breakers. Workers whose job was to reduce massive rocks into usable building materials using nothing but hammers, chisels, and their rapidly deteriorating bodies. Stone breaking was medieval construction's most punishing profession, requiring workers to spend their days hammering granite, limestone, and marble into smaller pieces suitable for building projects. The work was done entirely by hand, with workers using heavy iron tools to chip away at rocks that often weighed several tons. The physical demands were extraordinary, the noise was deafening, and the stone dust was slowly killing everyone who breathed it. The tools were primitive and dangerous. Heavy hammers that could crush bones if mishandled. Sharp chisels that could slip and cause devastating cuts. Wedges and bars that could spring back and knock workers unconscious or worse. Every tool required strength, skill, and constant vigilance to avoid accidents that could end careers or lives in an instant. The dust was the silent killer. Every hammer blow sent clouds of microscopic stone particles into the air, and workers had no choice but to breathe it in hour after hour, day after day. The dust accumulated in their lungs, creating a condition we now know as silicosis, which slowly suffocated workers from the inside. Most stonebreakers developed chronic coughs within their first year, struggled with breathing problems within 5 years, and died of lung disease within a decade. The noise was literally deafening. The constant hammering created sound levels that permanently damaged hearing, leaving most stonebreakers partially or completely deaf. But the hearing loss wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a safety hazard that made it impossible for workers to hear warnings about falling rocks, unstable walls, or other dangers that required quick reactions to avoid. The work was seasonal and weather dependent, but the conditions were never good. Summer heat made working with stone almost unbearable, as metal tools became too hot to handle, and stone surfaces radiated heat like ovens. Winter cold made the work even more dangerous, as frozen stone could shatter unexpectedly and send sharp fragments flying in all directions. The apprenticeship system created generations of families trapped in a profession that guaranteed early death. Boys started as young as 8 or 9, carrying water and cleaning up stone chips. By their teens, they were handling full-size tools and breathing full doses of stone dust. By their 20s, they were experienced stonebreakers with chronic health problems. By their 30s, most were dead. The social status was complicated by the essential nature of the work. Everyone needed stone for construction, but no one wanted to acknowledge the human cost of quarrying and processing it. Stone breakers were simultaneously indispensable and invisible, crucial to every major building project, while being excluded from the celebrations when those projects were completed. But if stonebreakers thought they had cornered the market on physically destructive labor, they hadn't met the charcoal burners, workers whose profession required them to tend massive fires in isolated forest locations, while breathing smoke so toxic it could kill them instantly, and definitely would kill them slowly. Charcoal burning was essential to medieval metallurgy and cooking, but it required workers to spend weeks alone in forests, tending enormous piles of burning wood, while controlling the airflow to create charcoal instead of ash. The process took constant attention, as too much oxygen would cause the wood to burn completely. while too little would extinguish the fire and ruin weeks of work. The smoke was lethal. Charcoal burners worked in clouds of carbon monoxide and other toxic gases that could cause unconsciousness or death without warning. They had to stay close enough to the fires to monitor and control them, but close enough to breathe concentrations of poison that would fell most people in minutes. Many charcoal burners simply collapsed and died beside their fires, overcome by the very smoke they were trying to control. The isolation was profound and dangerous. Charcoal burning required workers to spend weeks in remote forest locations, far from help if something went wrong. They lived in crude shelters, ate whatever food they could carry or catch, and faced constant threats from wild animals, bandits, and the weather. If they were injured or became ill, they often died alone beside their fires. The seasonal demands were brutal. Charcoal burning was typically done during specific times of year when wood moisture content was optimal, meaning workers faced intense periods of activity followed by months of unemployment. They had to earn enough during the burning season to survive the rest of the year, creating pressure to work longer hours and take more risks to maximize production. The fire management required extraordinary skill and constant vigilance. Workers had to understand wood types, moisture content, airflow patterns, and temperature control to produce quality charcoal. A single mistake could ruin weeks of work, while the constant need for attention meant that charcoal burners rarely got more than a few hours of sleep at a time during the burning season. The environmental hazards were constant. Forest fires could spread from charcoal operations, destroying vast areas and killing anyone caught in their path. Workers faced falling trees, unstable ground undermined by root systems, and the constant risk of getting lost in unfamiliar wilderness areas. The smoke also attracted attention from bandits and wild animals, making charcoal burners targets for violence and predation. As we reach the absolute end of our journey through medieval Europe's most nightmarish occupations, we're left with a profound understanding of human endurance and the price of civilization. These workers didn't just perform unpleasant jobs, they sacrificed their bodies, minds, and social connections to maintain the basic functions that kept society from collapsing into chaos. The stone dust that filled quarry workers' lungs built the cathedrals we still marvel at today. The toxic fumes that poisoned dyers created the beautiful colours that adorned royal courts. The caustic lime that burned workers' skin provided the mortar that held castles together for centuries. The smoke that killed charcoal burners fueled the forges that created the tools and weapons that shaped history. Every comfort we enjoy today, every technological advancement we take for granted, every social protection we assume will always exist, rests on a foundation built by people who had no such protections, no such comforts, no such assumptions about survival. They worked because they had to, endured because they had no choice, and died because their societies valued their labor more than their lives. The courage they displayed wasn't the dramatic kind that fills epic poems and inspires statues. It was the quiet, grinding courage of people who got up every morning, knowing their work was slowly killing them, and did it anyway because the alternatives were worse. They found dignity in degradation, meaning in suffering, and community in isolation. They proved that human beings can adapt to almost anything when survival requires it. Their stories challenge us to examine our own world with uncomfortable honesty. Who are the invisible workers whose sacrifice makes our comfort possible? What are we willing to accept in the name of progress and prosperity? How do we honor the contributions of people whose suffering we prefer not to see? The medieval world seems distant and primitive, but its labor dynamics reveal patterns that persist in every age. There are always essential jobs that no one wants to do, dangerous work that someone has to perform, necessary sacrifices that society demands from its most vulnerable members. The technology changes, the specific risks evolve, but the fundamental mathematics of survival remain depressingly constant. These workers lived and died in the shadows of history, their names forgotten, their suffering minimized, their contributions overlooked. but they were the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without them, there would have been no cathedrals, no castles, no cities, no civilization worth preserving or remembering. As you return to your modern life with its safety regulations and worker protections and social safety nets, remember that these comforts exist because previous generations learned from the suffering of workers like the ones we've met tonight. Every protection we enjoy was paid for with the blood, sweat, and early deaths of people who came before us. Their legacy isn't just historical, it's moral. They remind us that progress requires vigilance, that civilization demands constant effort to ensure its benefits don't come at the expense of its most vulnerable members. They challenge us to build systems that distribute both risks and rewards more fairly, that protect the dignity of all workers, that remember the human cost of human achievement. The darkness is complete now, and these ancient voices fade back into the silence they've inhabited for centuries. But their whispers will linger, reminding us that every age has its necessary sacrifices, its invisible heroes, its forgotten foundations. The question isn't whether such work will always exist. It's whether we'll have the courage to see it, the wisdom to value it, and the compassion to protect those who perform it. Sleep well, knowing that the nightmares of medieval labor helped build the world that protects your rest. And when you wake tomorrow, remember that somewhere, someone is still doing the dangerous work, the dirty work, the essential work that keeps civilization functioning. They deserve better than being forgotten, and we owe them more than we can ever repay. These weren't just the worst jobs in medieval history. They were the jobs that made history possible, performed by people who gave everything so that others could have something. And that, perhaps, is the most humbling lesson of all.